Make ourselves comfortable in our bodies. And maybe instead of watching the breath, we can be the breath, having all of us breathing at the same time, heart, mind, body. And since the focus of this session are the four sublime abodes or the four immeasurables, maybe we can just take one step into that practice, a practice where we contemplate, starting with may all beings have happiness and causes of happiness. Let's just do the first 3 words. May all beings. And before we think about what we're wishing for them or thinking about for them, let's try to really open our mind and let it embrace all beings, starting with ourselves. We are the being from which our experiences start. And right now in this session, we're connected with a number of other beings. We can just let our awareness go out to one another. And then we can consider those beings who easily come to mind when we think about others, partners, family, friends, neighbors. And we just bring them into our awareness. And then wherever our circle of awareness has expanded to, we can recognize that within that circle there are other beings, non-human animals, humans that we don't know or don't think of, but that are close to and connected with the people that we did bring to mind, with others who are connecting through this session. And we can know that at this point we still have a tiny percentage of the beings on this planet. So let's keep widening. And we can think of all the beings in the area surrounding us. Really, all of them. The birds above, the squirrels, raccoons, the ants that are walking on the surface, all the beings below the surface, all beings. And for now, we can focus on animals, human and non-human, knowing that every one of us has the capacity to experience, to feel pain or pleasure, to want some things, to avoid others, to suffer, to feel joy. Every being in the area that we live has that capacity. They are experiencing right now. So we just make space for them in our awareness. We don't need to imagine what they're doing or think about it. Just make space for them. And then we can make that space bigger. The whole country where we are. Could try even the whole continent. All beings. And then since there's really no reason to focus on one continent rather than another, we can open more widely and just make space in our awareness for the immensity of life and experience that's happening right now on this planet. And when we feel like we have a little bit of stability with this sense of vast presence of beings, just so it's not too abstract, we can just recognize that right now there are animals hiding. There are women giving birth. There are farmers bending over their crops. There's so many people driving in their cars. There are birds soaring, looking down from high above. There are worker bees making the rounds of their flowers. Those are all the beings that we share this world with. That we have space in our mind to hold, whose presence is part of what makes all of our experience possible and all life on this planet possible. And so with that sense of all beings, we can just contemplate for a moment or two the wish, may all beings be happy and have causes of happiness. So the practice that we'll be exploring is one that reappears in most Buddhist traditions, and has different aims or different uses in different traditions. And the practice of metta is actually the first of the four immeasurables, or the first of the four practices that we're doing. The order sometimes is varied in different traditions. In the Theravada tradition, where most of the teachings on metta that we receive are coming from, so there are many, many teachers teaching in English who are teaching metta practice, and it's called metta practice, which is a Pali term. It's not called Maitri practice, which is the Sanskrit term which would be used by the Mahayana traditions. So in the Theravada tradition, which follows Pali and uses the term metta, most of the practices that we might be familiar with would be coming through there. They've been taken up by many Mahayana teachers, many teachers in Tibetan Buddhism, because they're so effective and they're so powerful. But in the Theravada tradition, the four immeasurables, in the classical positioning of them, are used as a way to allow the mind to enter into states of meditative absorption or concentration, jhanas. So it's something very interesting that why is it that these four states, and so just to kind of situate us, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, where we are able to rejoice in others' good fortune, and then equanimity. So these four states of mind are states of mind that make us ready, able, and can lead very organically and spontaneously into states of meditative absorption. And that's something really interesting. What is it about being able to open ourselves with unconditional love that allows our mind to really rest? So that's something that's worth thinking about. In Mahayana contexts, and here including Tibetan Buddhism, because the Four Immeasurables is part of their Mahayana orientation and not specifically Vajrayana, in those contexts, the qualities themselves are the goal. The goal is not to develop enough of that quality in a meditative state to enter absorption, but to develop those qualities as human beings, right? As attributes of the spiritual path that we're trying to develop within ourselves. And I want to propose that these four immeasurables can be part of our thinking and our work to develop a way to live as related beings. So when we think about what it means to be interconnected or interdependent, how do we live in a way that fully reflects that and embraces that? And another way to ask that might be, and this is coming from the Bodhisattva path, what would be a way? Can we find a vision and cultivate that orientation within ourselves, a way to live such that our happiness and the happiness of others are not in conflict, right? If we had that, if we could really do that, the world would completely transform. If we could figure that out in ourselves and therefore necessarily with others, to really reorient ourselves, to have a vision, to have qualities, to have the ability to really experience our lives as something that, aims at a happiness that can simultaneously be productive for the happiness of others. And that could serve as an interesting way to think about what we're trying to do in our spiritual path in a way that we want to bring into our lives. Would we need to shift? And the work with Eco-Dharma is very much part of that. Eco-Sattva training is very much part of that. How can I live in such a way that I am pursuing my happiness, but my pursuit of my happiness is conducive to everyone's pursuit of happiness? And so the Four Immeasurables, and I'll wait and talk about how to actually best translate the terms that are used for it, because they're different in different traditions. But before, they outline these four qualities that is part of answering that question, living in such a way that we are attentive to the wish for happiness that all beings have. And also attentive to the fact that the causes of happiness need to be made visible and treated specifically, because otherwise we very frequently are pursuing happiness, what we hope will bring happiness, by doing things that are not causes of happiness. So to be very conscious that we want happiness, but we also want to be attentive, not just focused on the result, but really attentive to what actually brings it about. So loving kindness. Then also, obviously before we get to the point of being able to bring about the happiness and be a condition for the causes of happiness for all beings, we're also going to find many moments when we are harming. That our actions are a cause of suffering to other beings. So next we want to have attentiveness to that in the form of compassion. So attentiveness sounds sort of intellectual. All of these qualities, really are coming to settle in the heart. Compassion, not as an intellectual exercise, obviously. These are affective states that we're trying to install in ourselves in very particular ways through the Four Immeasurables, through this practice. Then the third one along the way is really, I think, much more important than often it's given credit for being. All the times that we do see others experiencing moments of happiness, satisfaction, triumph, gaining some good that will lead, that could be a cause for their happiness, every time we see that, if we had this quality, instead of feeling competitive, instead of feeling inferior or feeling less, instead of being confronted with our own inadequacies or sense of lack, we could simply think, yes, that's what I want. And how wonderful, and experience a sympathetic or empathetic joy with them. How powerful that would be for being able to live in a way that our happiness and the happiness of others are aligned. Right? So the third one, this empathetic joy, and then equanimity. How, and equanimity also, we can look at that in more detail later. There are different kinds of equanimity, and equanimity means different things in different presentations of the Four Immeasurables. Right? So does equanimity mean being able to stay steady, not losing our balance, not being pushed and pulled by constant, attachment, longing, desire, and dislike, aversion, cringing, fear. Like, how could we stay in a state that's more equal? In Mahayana terms, it's how can we be equally close or equally not distant to all beings in a similar way, including ourselves. So those are quite different. Seeing others, having like a radical equality among all beings versus oneself being able to stay steady. They're related, but they're distinct. So those four qualities, however we're going to define them, we'll leave that for later. Those four qualities as ways to begin to be someone who in the world is connected and who is a condition for others to be happy without having that turn into sacrifice. Because my needs and the needs of others are experienced as in conflict. And therefore, when I put myself to try to care for others, put others first, that means putting myself last, which means my needs drop off the map. And sooner or later, you're in trouble because your needs are not being attended to. So not having a zero-sum game, of happiness or well-being. So those four thoughts are, in this presentation, those are the ways to start to think about getting there and the ways to build within ourselves the capacity to live in that way. But for this first time, I wanted to kind of go slowly. And before we start trying to generate metta, before we start trying to move through the four, just really look at what are we doing just by trying to hold in our mind all beings. What are we doing to ourselves? What's happening to us inside? Just by very consciously, and we need to do it consciously because our world is not that big most of the time. We are focused on, for us, all beings is probably a list of about, not more than 100 people who enter our awareness on a regular basis. If you have if you're teaching lots of different classes, that number gets bigger. But in the ordinary day-to-day, the people that we are attentive to their needs, thinking about their happiness, concerned about their suffering, it expands. Sometimes it can get very big when there's a crisis, when there's a catastrophe. We may expand it somewhat, but very consciously say to ourselves, the world is much bigger. My circle of connected beings is much bigger than this, right? And our mind has the capacity to expand infinitely. And we don't have that many areas of our experience where we get to really connect with that capacity, to really make the mind as vast as possible. So stargazing is a good way to do that. Sometimes that's, I think for myself at least, sometimes sitting and looking at the ocean is a very useful way to help the mind just, really be much bigger than it normally tends to be. So in this practice, we start by really trying to encompass what that term means. All beings. Every single species on this planet, every single member of every single species of animal on this planet, right? And partly to give ourselves, a chance of actually maybe doing it, we can leave out the plants, partly because in the Buddhist presentation, they are generally considered not to have consciousness and therefore not to be yearning, longing, not to be pursuing happiness. I know that that's something that could be debated. But just for ourselves, like, let's see if we can just do it with the animals and see how that goes. In classical Buddhist terms, you're thinking about all 6 types, 6 realms of sentient beings, which would include devas, the celestial beings, asuras, another kind of celestial being, hungry ghosts, and hell beings. But, it's a big task just to think about the human and non-human animals. So we can probably be pretty satisfied if we really manage to make our mind that big. So when we're doing the practice, we are beginning by making the mind vast. We're learning to open our heart and our mind at the same time with the Four Immeasurables. Just learning to open. Forget about being able to love unconditionally everyone. Just open to their presence. That's already an ability. It's a life skill that, we might not necessarily have been taught. Open to the presence, to an awareness of what it means to be sharing this planet with so many others, and so much diversity within those others. And so this experience that we have of making our mind very big is also an experience of ourselves being bigger than what we normally think we are. When our attention is narrowly focused, when we have these routines that we're cycling through day after day, when we get very focused, which, life now is kind of designed to make us on getting through the lists of tasks day after day and trying to not have them be pushed off too much to the next day and try to not have them roll along too far behind us. When that's the orientation of life that we have, it's hard to really experience how much bigger we are. We're so much bigger. And having a place in our day or in our lives where we get to be in contact with the vastness of our own mind, with the vastness of what consciousness is really very healthy. It's very healing. And in the exercise of our spiritual capacities, it's key, right? So we'll also notice that we start, we want in these practices to link heart and mind. That is fundamentally what we're trying to do. We're directing our attention, so we're using our cognitive skills, or we could say, our more the conceptual or intellectual part of our mind, the thinking. We give ourselves a thought that we try to feel, right? So we're trying to bring together our heart, the place where we experience a longing and a connection, with the part of our mind where we recognize the connection, but may not necessarily be accustomed to feeling it. And so, a lot of the time it's easier to work with mind than heart. We are very, trained. Our education is focused on using, the mental capacities, not so focused on, okay, everyone, today our lesson is going to be in, we can have a lesson in empathy, but it might be, some international school might give a year dedicated to empathy and have a few sessions, but it's not like you have English and you have, science and you have math and you have emotions. It's not like that, right? So we become very adept at at thinking, basically. So we start there. We use our ability to think things, to tell ourselves, now I want to think this. And we might actually think what we told ourselves. Now I need to sit down and think about this. Whereas telling ourselves, now I want to sit down and feel this. It's like, how do we start? How does that work? And this is kind of an exercise in telling ourselves, now I want to sit down and spend a little time with the four immeasurable, and they are often translated as four immeasurable thoughts, which they are kind of thoughts, but we don't want to have them just be thoughts, right? So that's where it's going. But we work first with just having our mind be able to be aware, to think about the presence of all beings. And then from there, we can kind of slip into just feeling what that means, sort of holding the presence of so many others. We don't know what the content of their experience is, but we know that they're experiencing something, and we're all here experiencing, all trying through those experiences, to find peace, to be someone, to answer existential questions, to get, a meal, to find happiness and avoid suffering in whatever form that might take. It's all going on. And, we mostly have it very filtered. We are not, adept in being aware to more than one sort of crisis at a time. So here we're trying first to make space for others in our mind and in our heart. So that's what this this practice is designed to help us do. But not just, so the first step where we're just trying to really take seriously the task that the Four Immeasurables set us in, really making space, making our mind big enough to hold the presence of all beings. But once we've made space for them, then the question comes, how do we relate to others in that space? Right? When we've opened our heart and mind to the presence of others, our life is not just about us. It's this vast shared thing. And we can really kind of expand our consciousness to just touch the presence of that vast a number of beings. Then the question comes, how are we going to relate to them in that space? And that question I want to leave for later, because it is answered through each of these four qualities. We want to learn how to relate to others, without equanimity, without all the inherent biases that we have. And I think when we really look at what equanimity means and how to cultivate it, how we could ever get there, we have to bring an examination of our implicit biases or inherent biases, all the cognitive biases, because that prevents us from even noticing others and noticing that we already have put a lot of ideas on them and therefore we're not seeing them, right? And the inherent biases immediately create us and them, lots of us's and them's, right? And equanimity is about undoing that. Empathetic joy, compassion, loving kindness, those are instructions for how to relate to others once we have acknowledged that we are related to them. We start to experience our relatedness to them, and then we want to work with it. And so that's sort of how I would like to think about what the practice of the Four Immeasurables can teach us, can train us to do, can offer us. And just kind of on the point of what we are accessing when we spend a little bit of time and doing the practice, so I think many of you probably have in different practice that you do the 4 lines of the 4 immeasurables that you might recite on a regular basis. So I really recommend, first of all, saying all beings in every one of the 4 lines, to really not be abbreviating and not assuming, oh yes, I've my mind is holding all beings and now I can just drop that and start focusing on the qualities, but really connecting with that sense of what all beings means with each line. But also really spend some time. Don't move on to the next part without doing a little bit of whatever exercises work for you to make the mind big enough that you start to feel like, okay, yeah, I'm getting there. Like I really am starting to have a sense mentally, and maybe also starting to feel what it means to be connected to all beings. That everywhere that there's blue sky, there are beings. And make the mind, there are lots of different ways that you can do it, and I know that you're creative and can come up with them. One of them is like thinking about all the atmosphere, all the blue sky, and then think that everywhere that underneath it, that there, or in it or under it, there are beings everywhere. And so trying to think, and then those who are more mathematically inclined can like think in terms of numbers. Okay, like how many would 1,000,000 be? And how many would 1,000,000,000 be? And how many would 7,000,000,000 be? And how many species are there of animals? And how many members of those, like try to get there. And so one of the things that when we put a little bit of energy or time into kind of constructing the space where all beings might conceivably, imaginatively fit, we are trying to have a radically inclusive experience of what it means to be alive, of what it means to be an animal, human or non-human, on this planet, right? That they all count. They all count. So that experience of really just being more inclusive than we ever knew we could be. And then a second thing that happens that can be really interesting, and if you have the time and the inclination to play with it, you can keep giving yourself exercises to really try to think about all beings until we can experience a kind of shift, a kind of maybe a transcendental shift. And I think that what the thinking about all beings can give us is an experience of the sublime. Sublime in the sense of, there are different ways to kind of identify it. Sublime in the sense of something that is not vast, not large in terms of numbers or magnitude, but it is absolutely large. It is large in a way that is so large that there's no word for it. And there's a phrase that sometimes comes up in Mahayana Sutras that I really think the Buddha is trying to get us to this, where he'll say that it is so inconceivable that it can't be expressed even in an analogy. So taking us to the limits of what the mind can do. And another way to think about what the experience of the sublime can be, where we're able to experience the vastness of our own consciousness, the vastness of what it means to be aware. That there's a way of understanding the experience of something sublime. It's just like and maybe you've already had it doing some practices, and especially thinking about all beings, where you just feel like wow, you know? And if that's an experience of the sublime, what it might be doing is it's giving us an experience that shows us that our mind has a capacity that goes beyond any measure of our other senses. Like our mind can hold things that no physically, no, we can't see that far, we can't hear that far, but we can think that far. Our mind can go places that are not available to us otherwise. And so an experience of the fact that the mind can think of things that can't even be thought of. They can't really think of all beings, but we can think of it. Like our mind can do that. And so that's kind of, that is one of the experiences that I think working quite seriously with the part of all beings in the Four Immeasurables can put at our disposal. That we are, putting us in touch with the vastness of possibilities that we contain within ourselves and that the world contains within itself, right? So kind of both the sense of opening, of making a space that's vast enough within ourselves that we're willing to have everyone there. We're willing to host everyone, at least in our thoughts, as a first step. And maybe discovering that there's something quite joyful or enjoyable about thinking that. So we want to make our practice enjoyable. It's really so important that our practice not be something that we should do, that we should have done. It needs to be something we want to do. And so really kind of being attentive to moments in our daily practice where we're doing something that's like very satisfying in some way. And for me at least, really spending some time and trying to generate that sense of awe or kind of amazement or wonder at what it means that all beings, what it means that we are all here on this planet. So letting there be space in practice for emotional discoveries that we might be the same discovery we had, many other times that we did the practice, but it's still a kind of aha moment that we get to. And then within that space, we can start reconfiguring. How are we relating to all beings? So that's I think the promise that the practice of the Four Immeasurables holds out for us as human beings and as serious spiritual practitioners, which I think is totally fair to say that we are all, serious about our spiritual practice, not wanting to make it into something that's serious and therefore like kind of heavy and solemn and joyless. And just also a way that we can really start thinking about how to reorient our way of being in the world so that our aims, our happiness, and the happiness of others could conceivably be lived as mutually supportive or compatible. So that's our start with the Four Immeasurables.